colleagues, friends, سامعين؟
الكاميرا هذا
لا تجي.
هم سامعين بس بدك يسجل على الكاميرا كويس.
Okay. Colleagues, students and friends, it is a great pleasure for me this evening to introduce our speaker, Dr. Yasser Sulaiman. The main lecture by the Jewett chair, which is the annual one this year, is a very special one, comes on a very special occasion. It is part of the academic activities that are taking place in celebration of AUB's 150th anniversary. And for our distinguished lecture series, we could have hardly thought of anyone more distinguished than our present guest. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with his work. Some of you have told me that you have read 2 or 3 of his books on sociolinguistics and other subjects. But for the benefit of those who may not be so familiar, I will just say that Professor Yasser Sulaiman is a professor at the University of Cambridge, UK, and he is currently the acting president and provost of the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, which is an elitist institution which has just been launched, and we hope that it will have its impact in the Arab world. Yasser Sulaiman is a very well-known sociolinguist. He has published extensively in his field, and I have listed several of his publications in the abstract that you have received. Let me just mention a few. The Arabic Language and National Identity, a Study in Ideology, 2003. A War of Words, Language and Conflict in the Middle East, 2004. And Arabic Self-Identity, a Study in Conflict and Displacement, Oxford, 2011. I would also mention that he has contributed to the study of the history of Arabic grammar as well, and he's written a very well-known book on ta'leel. It's the whole title is The Arabic Grammatical Tradition, a Study in Ta'leel, which is the justification or the rationalization which the Arab grammarians tried to prove in order to justify linguistic or grammatical phenomena. You know, our grammar is not only descriptive, our grammarians usually try to give reasons for the various phenomena, and Dr. Sulaiman has studied this in depth, and his book is gave us a very good insight about the methods of Arab grammarians in this. I've actually read an article recently by Jonathan Owens in the Journal of Arabic Linguistics, and he says that this book is one of the most inspiring books that have ever been written on the history of Arabic grammar. There's one more reason to celebrate the presence of Dr. Sulaiman with us, and this is the fact that tomorrow he will be one of 2 external examiners who will attend the thesis defense of one of our students. You can guess she's here, Mrs. Hanadi Daya, and this, if awarded, will be the first PhD to be awarded by the Department of Arabic after 30 years of freezing our PhD program which started, by the way, in the late 60s and was frozen in the early 80s. So it's more than 30 years that we have granted a PhD in the department when it was revived. And by the way, Dr. Sulaiman was one of the external reviewers who came to this university to evaluate our PhD program when it was relaunched a few years ago. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Yasser Sulaiman. Before that, I would like to apologize for the room. We were not able to book a bigger room, but as you see, we have arranged it in such a way that to take. I'd like to welcome him as a close friend, as a celebrated scholar, and above all, as a friend of AUB. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Yasser Sulaiman.
Well, Professor Baalbeki, thank you very much indeed for the introduction. I I'm indeed very delighted to be at the AUB and also to deliver this lecture, the 150th anniversary lecture. Ramzi and I go back a long, long way. And there are also many friends here with whom I go back a long, long way. So I'm not going to embarrass them by telling them how old I am. So I'll just leave it at that. So it's a great pleasure to be here. And I was asked to talk about a topic that can open up discussion in a variety of ways. It will look at language, but take language into society and also into the politics with a small p of the contemporary Arab world. And the title is Language Ideology, the Arabs, Arabic and Language Anxiety, which is sort of a very maybe tempting, enticing title. Let me just say that language ideology will be explained in the course of my talk. Arabs, I'm not talking about Arabs as a racial group or as a national group. I'm talking about Arabs as those who form the language community of the Arabic language, which to me is very different from the speech community of Arabic. The language community is a different kind of construct from the speech community. And as far as the language anxiety is concerned, I will hope to be able to come to that later on and make a distinction between language anxiety and language fear and try to move towards a language policy perspective, which I hope to discuss with you. This is all very experimental, so I'm coming here in order to learn, to be critiqued, to be criticized, because I'd like to you to tell me whether this is worth pursuing or not, and if it is worth pursuing, maybe you'll be able to help me to take it forward. Part of the ideas for this came on the 27th of December last year. The Doha Institute and the Arab Center and the lexicon, the Arabic lexicon, which is to a great extent led by Dr. Baalbaki, they decided to have a UNESCO Day for Arabic. And there were also a lot of sort of coverage on the Arabic language during that period. And what interested me, of course, is this particular caricature cartoon, and says, "I love you, Dad," and speaks for itself. Anyway, what really mattered for me that day was we had people who gave talks, and they insisted on the study of Arabic as a scientifically, starting from the very well-known definition of linguistics as a scientific study of language. So they gave presentations. This is what science tells us about language. This is what science tells us about linguistics, tells us about Arabic. And this is how you should think about it. And then they finished, and then the audience said, almost ignored everything they said, and asked different questions. They said, well, they told the audience, well, look, all languages are equal. All languages can deal with the needs of their own sort of speakers. It is not true that Arabic is better than other languages, that Arabic is more beautiful than other languages. And we went into that, and when the question, as I said, the time for questions came, all of that was ignored. All the science was ignored. And now we went into what people think about language, what I have called in a paper that I've published recently, or a chapter I've published recently, folk linguistics. Folk linguistics ruled the day. Linguistics did not rule the day at all. It was about what people thought about language rather than what linguists thought about language. So I thought I'll begin by sort of showing you the title of this book. I'm sure that some of you or all of you know it, Language Myths. It lists a lot of language myths. And these are some of the language myths. I don't know whether this is clear or not. I don't know how to show it more clearly. But there are lots of language myths. For example, here, French is a logical language. Women talk too much. Some languages are harder than others. Some languages have no grammar, as we, for example, say about the dialects. The dialects have no grammar. And then here one who says, Italian is beautiful, German is ugly, right? And these are all language, they're described as language myths. And linguists in this book have tried to show that these myths are not really worth thinking about. They're just so utterly wrong that we should not really be thinking about them. But at the same time, it seems that people continue to think in those terms. Ordinary people continue to think in those terms. Now, as linguists, we say, well, this is not our business. I say, well, it is really our business. We need to actually think about how people conceptualize their languages. Because if language has a place and means something to its speaker, we need to understand the perceptions, the views, the beliefs, the doctrines, the opinions that speakers have about their language. And as linguists, we really need to pay attention to this particular aspect of how language is situated in society. So this is what my colleagues, some of them are known to, as I'm just repeating, they started by saying linguistic studies is the scientific study as a scientific study of language. The problem is this, is that generally in the social sciences, when you study a phenomenon so much, and you say the same thing so much about all languages are equal, there's no one language, there isn't a beautiful language, all languages are beautiful, or equally ugly, you expect those ideas in the end to filter, to penetrate society and to become part of the folklore of a society. And this is the question of the double hermeneutic, that theories and concepts that are used to study our social world with repetition, like al-istishraq, for example, they enter that a society and they become part of the phenomena of that society that linguists then have to study. It seems that this is not working in the case of Arabic. No matter how David and Ramzi and Qasim and everybody else tells us about that, well, that the fact that Arabic is more beautiful than our languages is incorrect, you can't really prove it, they seem to be unable to convince people to not to believe it. People still do believe it. In referring to these ideas about the beauty, the richness, the eloquence of a language, the term that's usually used is myths. And I want to query the use of the term myth. Because myth in English means it's something that you can't really test. You can't really test them. And they're sort of made up. And I just want to query the use of this term later on. Now, I want to, at this stage, say that in fact all these language myths are part of the language ideology, the folk linguistics of a society. And these things, for me, are things worth attending to and try to explain, to understand, and to deal with. However, what happens is that there are lots of factors that for linguists, at least, these factors seem to pull them away from injecting themselves in the study of language ideologies and language myths. You know, if I talk about language myths, I remember one of my friends said, if you were 25 or 30, your career would have been totally ruined, because nobody would take you seriously. In the linguistics community, what is he talking about? You know? So I want to bring that back into the fray, not just for Arabic, but also for other languages. So why is it that linguists seem to be sort of shying away from studying what the language ideologies of a society, the language myths of a society? There are lots of reasons. One of the first reasons is that the term ideology comes with clouds of pejorative meanings. If you say, well, these are حتى بالعربية, if you say ideological, it means it's a false consciousness. It can't be trusted. You know, that's what it means. So there are clouds of pejorative connotations, and the meaning itself is not fixed. Ideology seems to cover so much, to the extent that as a scientist you find it problematic to deal with it, because it could mean that, it could mean that, it could mean so many different things. So one of the reasons why I think linguists may have avoided looking at language ideologies of societies would be the fact that ideology has negative connotations. It is also associated with Marxist sort of false consciousness kind of interpretations of ideology. The other reason is that it's an elusive concept, ideology. It is a concept that you can't sort of define in a way that can allow you to operationalize it and use it in the study of language in society. And it's also a contested concept. Different interpretations of ideology, different meanings of ideology. So I would say that there are two reasons that I've established in the literature that might be involved in understanding why linguists haven't turned their attention to language ideology. The first is that it carries pejorative meanings, and secondly, it is a contested and elusive concept. But I want to add something else. It is because I think one of the reasons why linguists don't really attend to it, it's because of the dominance of a logical, positivist, and quantitative approach in studying language. Anything which is not can't be quantified, can't be tested, you tend to get away from it because this is not, scientists want to be in that realm. Anything which is outside that realm, which is the realm of ideology now, you don't want to really be there because as it were, the traditions and the paradigms of the linguistic community have situated us inside this, logical positivist paradigm. And I'm just using here Thomas Kuhn's notion of paradigm. And to wait for a shift of paradigm is going to maybe take a bit of time for us. Let me just now try to show you or try to explore with you, not explore, but try to introduce some definitions of language ideology. Judith Irvine is one of the best scholars on language ideology, and she defines it as a cultural system, this is my underlining, of ideas about social and linguistic relationships together with the loadings of moral and political interests. So you have a system, ideas about society and language, and then there are moral and political interests. And that is part of the mix of what ideology is about. Another one from Paul Friedrich, a very well-known one, he says language ideology is a system and then retracts, or at least an amalgam. He knows that a system is a very difficult word to defend. It's an amalgam of ideas, strategies, tactics, and practical symbols for promoting, perpetuating, or changing a social and cultural order. That is ideology as a whole, but also linguistic ideology is well within that. So ideologies are there to promote the cultural order or to contest the cultural order, so you can use them either way. And I'll show you examples of how language ideologies can be used to promote and to contest the social and cultural order. There is another one from a book called Ideology in Language Use, Pragmatic Guidelines for Empirical Research. And really this one tries to take ideology into empirical research. It says we can define ideology as any basic pattern of meaning or frame of interpretation. So pattern of meaning, interpretation, bearing or involved in an aspect or aspects of social reality, and it is inverted commas, felt to be commonsensical. Now we have a new word. It's common sense. Ideology, language ideology is about common sense. And common sense is what people somehow believe to be the case becomes the common sense position and view of that particular thing. So it is commonsensical and it becomes normative, as I hope to show. It becomes the thing that somehow is used in order to judge arguments or to promote arguments. So there's the idea of common sense and normativity. I have used a different interpretation in my book that I'm writing on this, because ideology finds its main home in politics. So I went and I said, how do politicians use ideology? And there are many, many definitions. And this is one of the definitions that I think really works very well for, anyway, the way I want to work on language ideology. And instead of political, I'll invite you to replace linguistic. So a political ideology is a set of ideas, beliefs, opinions, and values. So the idea that Arabic is beautiful, Arabic is rich, these are ideas, beliefs, opinions, and values that people hold, that exhibit a recurring pattern. And I would want to say that those ideas recur. We have lots of empirical research which shows that people believe Arabic is this, Arabic is that, so they recur. They are held by significant groups. There are large numbers of people who believe them. And three, they compete over providing, if you stop at two, that is where language attitudes work stops. That's where it stops. So language attitudes stop at number 2, and then language ideology now kicks in, and you start to look at how language ideology works. So language ideology then leads to competing over providing and controlling plans for public policy. So it interacts with public policy. And I'll show examples, and I'll give you examples, I hope, from my work in language educational reforms in a number of countries. And do so with the aim of justifying, contesting, or changing the social and political arrangements and processes of political community. Now, let me just go back and quickly try to give you examples, a very quick example of how, or examples of how this would work in the case of language ideology. So the idea that Arabic is beautiful, it's excellent, it's rich, it is what also we say, it's eloquent, fasiha. These are beliefs in society that are held by, I think, significant groups of people. We know we have empirical research to prove that. And these, when you come to language policy, they start to compete over providing particular plans for public policy. So for example, when I worked on language reforms in Qatar for 6 years, and this big project with RAND and CFBT, it's at that point that I started to understand what language ideology means. Because we were trying to improve teaching Arabic in Qatar. For example, using the Ammiya as a bridge towards the Fusha, and society kicked back, with enormous ferocity, to the extent that in the end they won. And in a set of standards of about 130 pages, only 2 standards that I wrote myself were allowed to go into it, because there was so much public opposition to the idea of using the Ammiya as a bridge towards the Fusha. Even that. They accepted it only in the case of 2 genres. The first one is the Sha'r al-Nabati, because the Sha'r al-Nabati has a high social status, and the other one in terms of al-Qissa al-Ammiya. So there are, my grandmother tells me a story, and then you write it down. And then those, they accepted those. Anything else was completely, in the end, in spite of, in focus groups and also in presentations, they kicked back. And they immediately said, you have come in order to destroy our language. You want, it's not about Ammi, this is not about Fusha. At the end of the day, what you wanted to do is really to promote the Ammiya. So this is an example of how language ideology in public policy kicks back. And then, with the aim of justifying, contesting, or changing the social and political arrangements and processes of a political community. What happens really there is that you have a group of teachers and inspectors who are now economically tied to those language ideologies. They have been raised with those language ideologies, and they thought that our ideas were not just about reform, it's about revolution, it's about undermining the values of society. And the teachers and the inspectors fought back. But they fought back really because they felt that this is threatening their own position in the economic and the economic sort of sector of the educational equation in society. And actually it was at that point that I started to get in language ideology. You come and you try to, in my book Arabic Self and Identity, I do an ethnography of myself on language reforms in Qatar. I study myself. And I started to, I tried to assure everybody that I used to say to them, if there was a, the Miss World contest, if I said, if there was going to be a lover of the Arabic language context, it would be in the end between Ramzi Baalbaki and Yasser Suleiman, and they'd have to choose one of us, right? But they did not believe it. They just thought, well, he is coming to destroy our language. And in the end, I can tell you, they won. So I came with linguistics is a scientific study of language, and they said to me, just forget it, yeah, just fine. But as far as our language is concerned, just keep it to yourself. Let me try to. So if you look at this, we have ideas, beliefs, opinions, values. These recur in society. They're held by groups, and then they're used in order to compete over resources in society. They're used in order to compete over who controls public policy, and they are sometimes used in order to undermine it. Let me give you an example of how language ideology works. Let us take the idea of the Arabic language is very rich. It has great, rich vocabulary. Now, let's look at borrowing. If you And we can see how language ideology can justify the richness element of language ideology. Folk linguistics in Arab society can be used to justify two opposing interpretations of borrowing. One group, the conservatives, will say to you, well, you don't need to borrow because Arabic has the resources that can allow you in order to build vocabulary from the inside. And those who want you to borrow will say, well, Arabic in the past, during our periods of glory, borrowed from everybody, and it's only through borrowing that you can really sort of enrich your language. And each one is using its own language, version of language ideology in order to affect sort of our perceptions of language and how language works in society. Now, if you want to study language ideology, what would you... Sorry, let me just begin by giving you my own sort of framework for studying language ideology. I believe that one way of trying to get into understanding language ideology would be to look at those covert, or as Americans call it, covert or implicit language ideologies. These are the myths. I prefer to call them traditions. The tradition that Arabic is beautiful. And you have overt or explicit language ideology, which I studied in one of my books. These are the political language ideologies. For example, how Arabic, it's for example, the place of Arabic, the Fusha or the Fasiha, inside sort of at the state level or sub-state level or supra-state level. So Al-Husri and others and Al-Arsuzi and Al-Alayli and how they talked about language. I'm not really interested here in the second one. I'm interested in the first one. So if you're interested in the first one, asatir, or myths, where would you find them? How would you access those? I would say you can do some ethnographic field work. I've done that on myself and in other places. You could do some interviews. You could also look at attitudes questionnaires. You could do participant observations, look at media and cartoons, and I have examples of all of those. Poetry, prose, and fiction. A good example of this, we all know Hafiz Ibrahim's poem. I have it at the bottom, which is عددت نفسي في حصاتي. Did you know that one? It's a very, I'll come to it. You'll see it in the end. You can actually look at political speeches. You can look at Friday sermons. I have a large number of Friday sermons. And they just say exactly the same thing. Al-Arabiya, wal-Quran, and all of that. Or you can look at paratexts. And I'm going to focus on paratexts. You can look at autobiographies. A good example of autobiographies is Edward Said's, which I studied in the same book, Out of Place, which unfortunately was so badly translated, the title in Arabic, because it said Kharij al-Makan. No, because out of place. Well, Edward Said did not mean Kharij al-Makan. He meant out of place in the sense of not being where you think you ought to be or you deserve to be, right? And in fact, when I looked at Out of Place, Edward Said's autobiography, it's about language. And that's what astounded me. And that book, the first time that Edward Said talks about being out of place, he does not talk about being out of Palestine, but being out of Arabic and into English. So that is where he was. And the book itself, if you read about 15,000 words, they're just analyzing that particular dimension of out of place. Autobiographies are very important. And sometimes the linguistic landscape, which I've done a study on in Arabic in the War of Words, when I studied the road signs in my Jerusalem, where I was born, and how, but just by following the road signs in Jerusalem, you can look at Jerusalem before Zionism, Jerusalem after the intervention of the British, and then Jerusalem with the advance of Zionism, and then Jerusalem under the Jordanians, then Jerusalem under the, and you can actually map the whole of the city just by looking at road signs. You can provide a fantastic history of the place by just looking at the road signs. I'm going to concentrate only on paratexts, atabat al-nusus. These are some of the, let me just develop the idea. In Arabic, I think there are two types of covert language ideology. There are the ideologies of confidence, what I call, and superiority. Beauty, logicality, lexical richness, eloquence, ethnic distinction, hikmat al-Arab. This is a very important principle of the Arabic grammatical tradition. And all of those I call as the ideologies of the past. the ideologies of the glorious times, of the times that we'd like to regain and bring into our lives in the modern period. And there are now other emerging ideologies. I call them ideologies of lack, deficit, and inferiority. Arabic is under attack. There are wars being waged against Arabic. There are treasons of the language. There are external enemies. There are internal collaborators, fifth columnists, and also the jumud wa tahajjur, fossilization. And I call them the ideologies of the present. Now, in order to talk about the ideologies of the present, I'm not really interested in the ideologies of the past. I'm interested in the ideologies of the present because they tell me something about anxiety, and that's what I really want to come to. On the 20th of February 2013, I don't know whether you can see it clearly, I decided to go and use words. I would just put in words like Arabic and then harb and see how many times the correlation of harb with language occurs in the Al Jazeera website. And look at the number of correlations I found. Harb on that day correlated with Arabic in 1,680 times. Mashakil 1,070. Azma 934. Khatar 761. And then Sa'ab, which is a different kind of thing, is 659. Himaya 637. Amn, and then Da'af, Taraja, Tahdid, Karitha, Qalaq, Tahaddiyat, Difa', death, saving, abandoning, aggression, marginalization, attack, test, mihna, fossilization, extinction. And you can just see how many times Arabic occurs with these correlates with these words in just one day. I don't know what the situation is like now. Now let me just come to what I called paratexts. The paratexts are, this is what paratexts are. Paratexts are titles, subtitles, intertitles, dedications, epigraphs, prefaces, epilogues, publisher's blurbs, or jacket copy, what is written at the back. Now, these are so very important in the transmission of language ideology, as I'll try to show in a moment. But in order to show this, it would be interesting to look at what do titles do. Generally, titles designate, they describe, and they tempt and entice. I mean, I wanted my title today to entice you. So language, and qalaq lughawi. Yes, it's really, so there it is to entice. I believe that, for me, titles refract language ideology, as I'll try to show you in a moment. You can do a lot of work on language ideology just by looking at titles, by looking at dedications, by looking at jacket copies, at blurbs, as I hope to show you in a moment. Now, how do titles work? Now, there are, and this is the framework that I've used, Gerard Ginnett's work. He distinguishes between the reader and the public. The reader is somebody who buys a book or gets a book or borrows a book or whatever it is and reads a good chunk of it, not necessarily all the book. The public are people who would look at the title, open 1 or 2 pages, look at the back and just leave it. They don't really engage the book. But in fact, the fact that they haven't engaged the book doesn't mean that they haven't been affected by the book. They become like a bee that carries with it something. And we have examples, as I'll show you, how this in fact works. So I'm interested now with titles, interested in titles. And I just want to show you how titles reflect language ideologies of the present, of lack, of defense, of attack. So you look at the title, you look at the blurb, you look at the ihda', and then you just walk away. But you have carried something of that particular engagement with you, and you've not completely, you leave the place not the same person that you have entered into that place, a bookshop or whatever. Let me give you examples of recent books. This is the title of one book, ملحمة انتقاد اللسان العربي. انتقاد, a lovely, lovely word. لسان العرب القلق. So this is the Arab's anxious tongue. So there's language ideology. The next one, التاريخ الفكري, the intellectual history of the crisis of the Arabic language. Another one, أزمة اللغة العربية في المغرب, the crisis of the Arabic language in Morocco, and then between pluralism and translation by one of our mutual friends, Abdul Qadir al-Fasi al-Fahri, Azma. So why? He talks about the crisis of Arabic terminology in the 19th century. There's a crisis. This issue, special issue, لغتنا العربية في معركة الحضارة, or Arabic language in the battle for civilization. Right. Another one, 80 years of Francophonie against Islam and Arabic. So there's a war against Arabic. A book from the 60s, 1961, published here in Beirut, الزحف على لغة القرآن, the onslaught against the language of the Quran. We all laugh. We all laugh, and I think it is right that you should laugh. But believe you me, when you go outside, that is what people believe. And you can't just not take what they believe seriously. Because actually what they believe and perceive to be the case is far more effective in their own lives and perceptions and how they behave than facts. Right. Another one, Arabic in the face of dangers, Al-Arabiyya fi muwajahat al-makhatir. And look at how the Arabiyya has been fractured. Al-Arabiyya has been fractured. And there are all these arrows are just attacking it. Right? But that's what you need. That's another one, and this is a very serious one out of Beirut here. These guys do this Dubai conference every year. 2,000 people go. It's a اللغة العربية في خطر. الجميع شركاء في حرب. Arabic is in danger. All of us are partners in protecting it. Another one, العربية تواجه التحديات. Arabic is facing challenges. Another one, دفاعا عن العربية. And this is from Fadil al-Jamali, who was the Prime Minister of Iraq. He actually was Iraq's ambassador who signed the United Nations Charter. Again, defending the Arabic language. Another one, إنقاذ اللغة إنقاذ الهوية. So saving language, by saving language you save your identity. تطوير اللغة العربية. And this is from a very famous scholar, everybody knows him. الهوية والعربية والأمن اللغوي. Now we have linguistic security, right? And you know, Abdul Salam al-Musaddi is not just anybody. I mean, at least he's a friend of Ramzi's, so I mean, he must be somebody. And it is dirasa wa tawthiq. There's tawthiq, and it's not in it. Amn lughawi. This is from Raja al-Naqash. Will the Arabic language commit suicide? هل تنتحر اللغة العربية? Right? Again, Musaddi, his friend and my friend. العرب والانتحار اللغوي. Arabic and linguistic suicide. Right? I mean, Nadia is sitting saying, oh my God, what are they doing? But that's exact. Actually, if you go outside, you'll see that people, good groups of people, do believe these things. Here, that I found it in Morocco in ولغتاه وعربيتاه ومعتصماه فهل يسمع المعتصم النداء.
Another friend of mine.
Is he? Yeah. I didn't know that you have.
He's on the board.
That you live in that you fraternize with such company. But look here, ولغتاه وعربيتاه ومعتصماه فهل يسمع المعتصم النداء. And in fact, if you talk to people, there's a lot of empirical research which shows you that people believe that Arabic is under attack, there is danger, and all the rest of it. But let's actually think about what that means later on. Now, but there are people, these are the fifth columnists. These, if you are a defender of the Arabic language, people like Uzon is a fifth columnist. جناية سيبويه. الرفض التام لما في النحو من أوهام. And I'm going to be asking questions about that tomorrow. But there you are. نحو التام لما and رفض التام. The total جناية, the Sibawayh's crime, right? Crime. Complete rejection of all the balonies in Arabic grammar. And this is one which has actually made a lot of noise. شريف الشباشي لتحيا اللغة العربية يسقط سيبويه. Right? For the Arabic language to survive, we need to bring down Sibawayh. Yeah? So I translated this, long live Arabic, down with Sibawayh. Because this actually works like a slogan. I don't know, I mean, people, I don't know whether, when I was in the UK, I loved demonstrations. So I used to go and demonstrate about anything. And in demonstrations, you know, the front party, as it were, would say, and in my days, they say, Maggie, or not Margaret Thatcher, Maggie, 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 and at the back, we would say, down, 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 right? And in Palestine, actually, it's very interesting that for سقوط يسقط سيبويه. So what you have here in this particular one, Sharif al-Shubashi was the deputy culture minister in Egypt in the 1990s. Wrote this book, and then there was a lot of critique. The people criticized this book. People spoke about this book. People started to demonstrate against this book, and quite a lot of the people who demonstrated against it never read it. All they knew is the title. How could you call for down with Sibawayhi, Sibawayhi, down with Sibawayhi? Most of the people didn't know even who Sibawayhi was, but they thought there was something serious. يسقط سيبويه لتحيا اللغة العربية يسقط سيبويه. And this is an example of how a title works. How titles actually refract. They actually sort of absorb language ideologies, the doctrines, beliefs, opinions, views of people about language, and then they put them as titles. Then you look at the book. What you're doing actually is you're reading your language ideology in the title. And that's how the title works. So this is an example of how language ideology works through titles. And I just wanted to focus on this particular section. Now, I come to language anxiety. The term language anxiety has started to be used in the last 20 years, particularly 15 years. Even in the big report that was published by منتدى الفكر منتدى تاع خالد الفيصل منتدى الفكر العربي, a big book, مؤسسة فكرة, and actually they published a really nice book. But in the introduction, there's quite a lot of القلق. It just talks about القلق اللغوي, language anxiety. So it has become a term that people started to use. However, I wanted to think about this, and I said, well, anxiety, well, the people who've done some work on this are psychiatrists, people like that, they worked on it. So I went to that psychology, psychiatry, and what's the difference? And I discovered that they distinguish between fear and anxiety. Fear, you fear something, and the source of the fear is known to you. But if you are anxious, it becomes like a generalized anxiety. You don't know what the cause of that fear that you have is. It is sustained. You don't know the causes. And anxiety generally is always forward-looking. You're trying to protect yourself against those fears that are sort of coming your way. So I said, well, let's try to see if we can distinguish between linguistic fears or language fears and language anxieties. And I think it does work. So I would say all the talk about Arabic students, the low levels or the weak performance of students in schools. The Arabic is weak, the imla is weak, the dictation is weak, the grammar is weak, the i'lam, the media, they're full of mistakes. And we need to protect ourselves against it. I say this is a fear a fear from something that you can identify. You can say, well, it's about improving the standard of students in writing, in having correct spelling, in having better grammar, in being this and that. You can sort of. So fear is something that you would be able to somehow identify the cause of the fear, the reason behind it. Whereas with language anxiety, somehow you can't. It just floats there. And I always sort of joke about it by saying this is a joke that my father told me when I was very little. And he said, there was this man who was frightened of mice, and or anxious about, frightened of mice. And then they convinced him that that little mouse can't eat him, so he shouldn't be, can't harm him. And he said after 2 years of help and therapy, maybe this man was in America, not in Britain, because in Britain they wouldn't send you to a therapist, but in America they might. Oh, please don't put it on the. So this man, after 2 years, said, I believe it, the mice can't harm me. And he said, I'm convinced of that. But have you convinced the mice? have you convinced the mice? I'm convinced they can't harm me, but please convince them that they can't harm me. And this is the kind of sort of anxiety that no matter what you do, it stays with you. So I am saying that we should start to distinguish between language fear, which is associated with the falling standards, with the fact that people don't have the right competencies in schools, in the media, and this generalized fear, attack, khatar, zahf, and all of those things. These are so generalized, and when you read the book, you say, what is the cause? You end up not knowing what the cause is. But there's some kind of fear. So I'm saying here that we need to distinguish between language fear and language anxiety. Now, I also say that language fear is related to the instrumental role of language, the communicative role of language, your mastery of language as a system, and without the values that are attached to language. Whereas anxiety, particularly in the Arabic context, is not about the instrumentality of the language, but it's about what I call in my work, it's about the ability of Arabic to symbolize. It's about the fact that Arabic carries in it symbolic meanings that refer to your identity. It's about the identity side of language. It's not the instrumental side of language. It is the identity side of language. And most of the titles that I have given you refer to the second one, not really the first one. They're about anxieties that are related to the question of who we are. What is our place in the world now? Are we good enough for our past? That is where language anxiety, that's how language anxiety works. So it's not really it's not anxiety about language, it's anxiety through language about things that are not linguistic. And that's what we really need to understand. Now, so language fear is related to the instrumentality of language, and language anxiety, in my interpretation, is related to the symbolic roles of language. The fact that Arabic symbolizes something about who we think we are or we're told we are. Now, how do we relate this to language policy and language planning? Most of the work that is done in language policy and language work in the Arab world, in fact, tries to respond to this dichotomy in a very sort of muddled kind of way. In language policy, there are two major distinctions, and Dr. Shaban can correct me. There's corpus planning, which is about having dictionaries, having manuals, having this, having that, having textbooks, having all of those things. These are corpus planning issues. And then there's status planning issues, and this is about which language we choose and how we nurture it and all of those things. And I just say now that language fear is related to corpus planning. It's related to the instrumental role of language, and you can deal with it by having plans, and at least you can propose plans for it. Whereas language anxiety is related to status planning, to the status of a language in society, and that is ultimately related to language ideology, what people believe, what they think. And those beliefs and thoughts about language are not, in fact, linguistic in the strict sense, but they are thoughts of an extra-linguistic nature. They're about something outside language, but we read it through language. And that's how language is so great in trying to give you an insight into the dynamics of society. So I think I've taken you on a journey. Ultimately, I came to language anxiety and language fear, and I just would like to invite us to start to rethink how we reform our language, our school systems in the language area, in the Arabic language area, because we're providing corpus planning, instrumental kind of related solutions to what in effect are language anxiety and corpus planning issues that are not really strictly speaking about language, but about something outside language. There are people who believe that I believe that we must make that distinction. Otherwise, and this is through my work in Qatar, in Oman, in Abu Dhabi, and also in Abu Dhabi and in Egypt, people were confusing these things together. And if you don't separate them, you can't contest in society, you can't promote, you can't affect language policy. That is, if you really want to affect language policy, which is what ideology helps you to do, then you must start to break them down. I've been told several times that this qalaq lughawi, this language anxiety that we who speak Arabic, people who belong to the Arabic language have, is something new. I even gave you the impression that it might be something new. But in fact, it's something that has been there for a long time. And I don't know how to read this, but this is quoted from an older text. وذلك لما رأيته قد غلب في هذه الأوان من اختلاف الألسنة والألوان حتى لقد أصبح اللحن في الكلام يعد لحنا مردودا وصار النطق بالعربية من المعايب معدودة وتنافس الناس في تصانيف الترجمانات وتفاصحوا في غير اللغة العربية. هي تفاصحوا في غير اللغة العربية. فجمعت هذا الكتاب في زمن أهله بغير لغته يفخرون وصنعته كما صنع نوح الفلك وقومه منه يسخرون. Right? And you can see from the style that this is not a modern text. He says وسميته.
Wow. There's even an older text by Ibn Durayd.
Yes.
Probably saying the same thing, 3 centuries before.
Yeah, and Ramzi is just because the only thing I could find in Duha was Lisan al-Arab. I wanted Ibn Durayd. But look at this, because also Lisan al-Arab has this iconic place in our culture, Lisan al-Arab, Lisan al-Arab. And you could see the motivation behind writing Lisan al-Arab. He felt the world is coming to an end. Arabic is, what's happening to Arabic? So he just collected and sort of compiled this dictionary in order to fight back, right? But these sentiments are exactly the sentiments we have now. So what does that mean? Is it possible to have a language without qalaq lughawi? No. There will have to be language anxiety to a language all the time. English is full of language anxieties in the English context, British context, and the American context. But also, let's look at the French context. Sorry, this is the poem I wanted to. And then look at Hafid Ibrahim, 1903. رجعت لنفسي فاتهمت حصاتي وناديت قومي. I think we know this poem, and at least I think this poem I have done I looked at the website at the internet, and it's given different titles, and this is a very, very famous song, famous poem. And in fact, many of the dedications in many of the books that I've flashed, not many, some of them will use 1 or 2 lines from this poem as not dedications, as epigraphs, not dedications, epigraphs. Because they would use the Quran, they would use the Hadith, and then they would use these famous poems. So this is in 1903, and he's telling us exactly what we are he's complaining about what we are complaining about now. But Arabic is still with us. It hasn't sort of disappeared off the face of the earth. Now, let's just go to France. And I just decided to use Amin Ma'louf in his book on identity. أو بالعربي الهويات القاتلة. And when you read this book, it's actually about language. He starts by saying, every morning I wake up and I see the French being depressed and having a really, really awful time. I know that it is because of the bad state in which the French language exists in relation to English, of course. And then he talks about Arabic. It's a book about, Now, it's quite interesting that this book was translated twice, not once. And there's other translation. Now, when a book, and these 2 translations I've read them, they're not very different. They're both equally good. When a book gets translated twice, it's because there is a horizon of expectation. There's ufuq intidar. It's the reception theory that is waiting for it. Because Al-Huwiyat al-Qatila is a very bad title, but this is really about, it's about Arabic, and it's about French. It's about language in general. So I've given this about the French. I've referred to the English. To the English language situation. I've talked about Arabic. I've talked about Lisan Ibn Mandur. I've talked about Hafid Ibrahim. Just to try to, because if I was talking to a foreign audience, they would say to me, oh, the Arabs are just obsessed with their language, aren't they? They just always, what's wrong with them? And I just want to say, please don't give me this thesis of Arab exceptionalism, that the Arabs are outside the human norm. In fact, there isn't a language that is not involved in some kind of language anxiety and language fear. So we, the Arabs, are inside history, not outside history. We laugh, but we are still inside history, because I can show you things in English which will make you really, really drop to the floor just by laughing at what the English are saying about, oh, the world has collapsed. For example, the famous quotation, in 1983, when the government stopped teaching grammar, it is at that moment that morals and standards in English went down, right? Because grammar is not about grammar, it's about discipline. It's about sort of, anyway. And then I'm going to say to you that this crisis, and this is also, I know that Nadia used it in her thesis because I examined her thesis at Oxford. This is sort of something about crisis. Crisis has a medical meaning, it has a theological meaning, but this is the last bit here. Crisis becomes a structural signature of modernity. So in fact, our language fears somehow, and our language anxieties, we should celebrate them because they show that we are still inside human history and we are also part of the human race. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sulaiman, for a very inspiring lecture. I certainly look for receiving the final text, which we shall publish on our website, as well as in the form of booklets like we always do for our distinguished guests. Now the floor is open to questions. Dr. Dalal.
Thank you, Dr. Sulaiman. So, how would you handle language anxiety as opposed to the approach to how would you handle it?
I don't think you can handle it. That's what I'm saying. It's a human condition, right? But I think somehow it will start to abate a little bit when the Arabs start to feel, Arabic speakers, Arabs, right, start to feel better about themselves. You'll see that the temperature will go a little bit sort of down. So I can't really provide a solution to language anxiety. I can provide solutions to language fear. But I think new concepts of language policy might help you. And it's about, because language policy now has changed and it's become sort of a kind of language management. If you can inspire people as individuals to take a position on their own language and language use, then without waiting for language policies from the top, if you start from the bottom up, then you'll start to change things. I'll just give you from my own personal experience. Before coming to work at the Doha Institute, because I sort of spoke in English all the time and all of that, I was so absolutely terrified to speak in Arabic, particularly amongst people who use Arabic all the time, and particularly in meetings of the Board of Trustees, and Ahmed Dalal is on the Board of Trustees. But actually, I've taken the decision that I really must face my demons and fears. And I must, give, and that's why I would have given this also in Arabic, I think, almost equally comfortably. And in order to do so, I started to write little sort of articles in the press, to the extent that my family have started to say, well, your Arabic is improving. I decided to do what Saad al-Husri did. Saad al-Husri spoke Arabic with a Turkish accent. But he decided that he was going to speak Arabic. And if every one of us decides, not against other languages, that no, I'm going to speak in Arabic, I think you'll find that language anxiety will start to sort of recede, but not completely disappear, because I think language anxiety is a human condition. It has existed in the past. It will exist in, Lisan al-Arab is about language anxiety, right? Which is, nobody would have thought when I said, وَسَمَّيْتُهُ, and they said, you saw Lisan, I said, I looked at your faces, Lisan al-Arab? Lisan al-Arab was about that. So you can't completely eradicate it, but you can maybe, if we as language managers in our own lives start to take decisions for ourselves, I think we will start to maybe fight it back. But it's very difficult to do so. Again, I'm not telling secrets now, but our staff at the Doha Institute, our policy is to use Arabic as a language of teaching. We use also English. Students can write essays and theses and dissertations in English if they want to. Most of our staff, faculty, are bilingual. They have come to Doha. If you give them a school that provides quality education in Arabic, and you give them a school that gives them inferior education in English, they would choose the English one. Right? Let me give you an example again from my work because that's really very important on language reforms. When we did the language reforms package in Qatar, we faced a question, and it was led by RAND and CFPT, big organizations, and I was working with them. We came to what language would Qatar use for teaching science and maths? Now, we wanted to look at the experiences of other nations and countries. So we looked at Hong Kong, we looked at Canada because of the sort of bilingual immersion language situation. We also looked at the West, so California, and we looked at Lebanon. And the person who was leading it in Lebanon was George Bohas. I told you about it, yeah. George Bohas, people don't know this. I don't know, I hope that I'm quoting him correctly, but he was one of the biggest Francophone educators in this country. But he noticed that Lebanese students were not doing well in international tables, league tables, in maths and science, which will surprise you. And look at the TIMSS results year after year. Lebanon is doing really badly, not very well. In fact, in science, there was, no, in maths one year, the Palestinian territories were doing better than Lebanon. Right. Now he just studied the French sector. And he, in the end, did his PhD at the Sorbonne, and he had 2 groups and taught maths and science in Arabic and maths and science in French. And the Arabic group outperformed for 3 years the French group, except for those for whom French in Lebanon is almost a native language. Right? Now, then we started to look at the Tajribat Madaris al-Maqasid al-Khairiyya in Lebanon. When they taught science and maths in Arabic, they were getting better results, but under pressure from the parents, they moved to English and the results went down. So you have actually evidence which shows you that you do better using your own language in these subjects than using. But try to convince faculty who have come to an institution which says we will teach in Arabic and iltizam bil Arabiyya kada kada. They all want to send their children to English language medium schools. So the families have a role. They must manage their own language policy as a family because they need to have a language policy. So it is not top down. It is not sort of, it's top down, bottom up. It's also a question of commitment, but you can never eradicate it because it's a human condition.
Yes. Dr. Al-Bara.
Thank you for your interesting lecture. I have 2 questions. The first question is, I work in intellectual history. I'm also very interested in characters and how they sort of frame disciplinary boundaries. It seems to me that this note of anxiety, this note of the need to take stock, the need to preserve, etc., especially in the lexicon, more evidently, is also a kind of a formulaic presentation that you find a lot in history. Every age laments the loss of history, etc., etc. And I wonder to what extent can we also think of this as a form of convention, a staging of authority, a staging of disciplinary authority, and not a very real anxiety in that sense. And sort of moving from there to think about, as you mentioned and as you referred to the notion of crisis, something very specific happens to language with modernity as well. So if there are anxieties, they're obviously of a very different or somewhat different nature. So I was wondering if you can comment on that. And the other smallish kind of question as well is, could you elaborate a little bit on your reluctance to use the term myth? And in connection to that, something that seems so commonplace, seems so real, that we kind of laughed at, but seems very real and incredibly commonplace, does not in itself beg the question of whether our own disciplinary formations are myths, beginning with linguistic as the scientific study of language.
You're my friend, right? Because I'm just fighting against, I'm sometimes exercised. Let me just begin with why is it I don't think myth is a good term, right? Because I prefer the term tradition, as I said, not myth, because myth itself has pejorative meanings, right? And I don't really want to associate that kind of connotation with the ideas and the beliefs and the opinions and the views of people about language, folk linguistics. That's one. Secondly, I think it misses the point, because these ideas, beliefs, opinions, whatever, they don't have a content that can be somehow brought face to face with empirical studies that can refute those contents to show them to be false, imagined, constructed, or whatever, right? And that's why I think we need a more neutral term. That's why I'm not really comfortable with the term. I'm doing a book, and there's a big section on this particular point. That is why I just like tradition more than myth, because these are perceptions, and perceptions can't be sort of brought down by facing them with reality and with statistics. But reality is, we have studied a sample of 200 million people, and that will not. It is like the mouse. Will the mouse not eat me? So that's the kind of thing. That is why one reason. The other thing that I agree with you that they become like, these things become like slogans almost. I'm referring to the paratexts in particular. The question is that they become common sense and they become normative. And when things become, they're reflecting common sense and they become normative. And when things are in that sort of space, then they become social axioms. They're taken for granted. Now, if you query them, people think that maybe there's something wrong with you, right? And that is why I think it is the fact that they've become almost, you repeat them without thinking about them. But that is, they become like that. But at moments of crisis, and now I want to go to Gramsci, he says, when there's crisis, language comes to the fore, right? Notes from prison. Let me give you an example of how crisis brings things to the fore. Just because that, to me, identity is not lifestyle. Now, imagine this, that there are people who wear size, we use 40 here in shoes, or 8, because in Britain they use 8, 40. So there are men who use size 40 shoes. For some reason, suddenly, there are no size 40 shoes, 41, but 40 shoes in the market. You can't import them from anywhere else in the world, right? Suddenly, that crisis might end up with people who wear 40 size shoes to start to come together and talk about the crisis of 40. There is something about 40. So a crisis brings something to the fore. And I'm saying that this sort of focus on language and on this sort of normative, commonsensical repetition of normativity and commonsensicality is in itself as a sign of crisis. But this crisis has been with us for a long, long time. It has been with us clearly from Ibn Durayd, and then we are coming to Lisan al-Arab in the 700, and then we are coming to Ibn al-Athir and the others. And so it has been there all the time. So, and they become conventional. You're absolutely right. But when you start to think about them, why is it that they're being repeated and repeated and repeated? And there's some variations on them. And then when you open the book and you look at the epigraphs, you look at the dedications, then you look at the tasdir. I've done a chapter in my book, 2013, Arabic in the Fray, about language ideologies. I wrote a chapter about 30,000 words without even getting into the book, right? And I think it is because these things have become so iconic that people repeat them and churn them out. But then at a moment of crisis, somehow the old sort of dormant meanings start to, wake up. And then new sort of connotations and new meanings start to be added to them. Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm glad to have a friend in studying paratext, because I think in Arabic they have been really, particularly amongst linguists, have been and these are great scholars. Sheikh Bushikh, yeah, wa mu'tasima, right? And Musaddi is al-intihar al-lughawi. Musaddi is telling us Arabic is, yeah.
But surely, yes, there's a reason for that. Don't forget what the British and the French have done to Arabic in this part of the world. They tried to
of course, yes.
ban students from speaking their own language. And it doesn't come out of nothing.
Of course.
There are
I agree with you.
reasons.
And that is, I think, the idea of attack. But attack has become also.
Attack,
yeah. Of course, yes.
vector.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Amin.
First, I want to thank you because I think that the topic of your lecture is probably maybe the important idea that we should be discussing in so many areas. I have a feeling that probably in every person in this room will have many examples of cases where how people think about Arabic has either been an obstacle in sort of practical attempts to do something in society or even do some research. So I want to thank you very much for bringing this to the fore. I wanted to bring up two issues. The first, a question related to the role of diglossia. And you started in the very beginning referring to sort of the difficulty in Qatar of people thinking about the dialect as something to consider. So one issue was in your comments towards the end of your lectures, you were alerting us or warning us to avoid, treating Arabic as exceptional, and to make sure to see it as just another language with the same anxieties that have occurred in societies with other languages at different times. And so my question is, where does the Fusha and the dialect dichotomy fit there? Because there seems to be a specificity to that. So how should we approach things aware that this is such a big issue? For me, an example of the importance of this, I'm interested in this issue in relation to science learning. The project that I'm working on relates to teaching science in Arabic in elementary school. And one very, very clear example that occurs that shows that the dialect is sort of, the distinction between the dialect and Fusha is so important, is that a teacher, in talking about, can have an extended conversation, rich discussion about the topic with students in the dialect. And then when it comes time to write down what is the key idea to take away from this discussion, it gets written in the Fusha. And so that distinction immediately is a very, very sharp one. And so I'm wondering, where does that leads to anxiety, it leads to hierarchies and what's important and all sorts of things. So I'm wondering where that fits in your thinking about the issue. The other issue is maybe more of a comment, which is I think there's a great value for tools from other disciplines in trying to get at the implicit ideologies. In particular, in the cognitive sciences, there's a lot of work on folk concepts versus scientific concepts, and so there are a lot of interesting tools there for analyzing implicit metaphors, hierarchies of conceptual structures, so it could be a rich area to represent folk understandings.
Well, I mean, diglossia is an old sort of question that has been with us with some time. Actually, in my framing chapter for the book I'm writing, I begin with Ferguson, because Ferguson, I believe Ferguson hasn't been read correctly. Ferguson begins by talking about diglossia, true. But Ferguson never really thought of diglossia as two ends without a continuum. I mean, he attends to the continuum, but he says, I know it does exist, but I can't do everything. It's actually what really annoys me with people when they review your book, and you say in the first page, for example, the Arabic language and national identity. I say, I'm not going to deal with North Africa. Then some tired reviewer writes, it's a great book, but he hasn't dealt with North Africa. I told you, I'm not going to deal with North Africa. And I gave you reasons why I didn't want to deal with North Africa. So I think the concept of diglossia, we need to go back and to really rethink it. And to get it out of this sort of dichotomy of two things that are fighting with each other. I think that is not the way to approach it. And I think diglossia, the article, the paper, can help us to do that. What's interesting about, again, diglossia, I speculate, if diglossia, Ferguson says, I'm getting off the point, Ferguson says, my study is impressionistic. That's what he says.
And then he's criticized for being impressionistic.
Yeah, absolutely. But my point is this, David, and I say this in my book. If you go and look at the bibliographies of books and articles that have been written on diaglossia worldwide, you say to yourself, how is it that something which is so impressionistic can lead to an explosion in our understanding of language? And I use this in order to fight against the logical positivists who want us all the time to quantify and to do it in such and such, so that everything which is outside this norm doesn't belong to us. So, for example, my answer to diaglossia is this. First of all, I don't see them as fighting against each other. Secondly, I believe that the term speech community is such a bad one, because in the Arabic language situation, you must have two communities. You have a speech community, which is about people learning their language naturally from all the rest of it, and you have a then you have a native language community. So you have a speech community and a language community. And the language community is a community that coalesces around the fasiha, not necessarily fasah. So coming to your point, I think, I don't know how to do it, but I think we need to find ways of changing perceptions of the Fusha and the Ammiya, the Fasiha. And we need to work with people's perceptions of how bad their Arabic is. I wrote a big piece for Al-Arabi Al-Jadid called مأزق لغة أي لغة. And then I tried to show that if we have a مأزق لغة in the Arab world, it is, yes, we have a مأزق لغة عربية, but there's a greater مأزق of those people who think their English is so good that when they produce English, it is much worse than the Arabic they produce, right? And every day I'm just coming, people who speak fantastic English, correct English, but culturally inappropriate English. You say, well, yeah, you can say that in English, but somehow culturally inappropriate. Whereas I'll tell you that the weakest person in Arabic will never make mistakes in the cultural appropriacy of their language, but they will make mistakes in the, So my point is that we need to let teachers who teach science actually dig deep and find that they have inner sort of language resources that they have not acknowledged, and I've seen that myself, that if they make mistakes, it doesn't really matter, as long as they use them as a way of, in the future, maybe overcoming those mistakes. Your point about folklore, I agree with your folk ideas. And if you can send me some references, I'll be very, very happy. I've seen some work, but I really need to deepen this kind of work. It's about these folk ideas can't be ignored, because they interact with public policy. They actually interact with how money is divided by the state. What kind of reforms do you do? What kinds of so if you're interested in language policy and public policy, you need to attend to these things. Otherwise, you're really ignoring them at your peril. Yeah.
Any more questions? Can take one more.
For example, I work with the pluralistic approaches where when, for example, a teacher, or because now we have a problem with even teacher when they practice French or English in the state school in Lebanon, and also the children have problem because they don't know how to express themselves. And when we ask them, even in French language class, for example, to speak in Lebanese, they become more confident, and then they become secure, and they speak better French, and it was the same experience with my colleagues with English. What do you think about, for me, I don't think that or Arabic or, and with this, and because there's a lot of concepts now, we show that, for example, learning math or science in a lot of certain language, and seeing how each word, the concept is understood in a different way. So it's better to grow up with this. What do you think about it?
Well, I think I from my sort of professional life, not my, I agree with you. In fact, when you have confidence in yourself, your language performance will improve across the board. So if, for example, you can access that confidence through the route of Arabic, and you've seen the reflections not just in Arabic but outside Arabic, right? So it's about giving the person that confidence. And I think we should not think of languages as competing with each other. But also to say, generally, I'm not standing for Arabic for ideological Marxist reasons. I'm standing for it because, in fact, I think you can do more complex work with Arabic through Ammiya, clearly. And that's fine because it's part of Arabic. Ammiya is not outside the realm of the Arabic language. It's part of it. So, and I think that we should change ourselves by going into languages that we do not master very, very well. And then just my final point. What really surprised me are the results in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was in the top 10 all the time under the British. And then suddenly, as far as I started to see changes in the position of Hong Kong. Hong Kong gone down to, so up to 5, up to, from 9 to 5. And we asked the question, why? And then we discovered that maths and science were returned to Chinese. So they started studying in Chinese. That was the only variable. They started to study those things. Look at Tim's results. They will, they'll really surprise you, Tim's results, because they will sort of give you cause for concern about this belief that our education here is so superior. Maybe it's superior regionally, but in fact it's not so superior outside the region. And part of it is because language has been really, the question of language has been really ignored. The kind of things that you can do with your language, Ammi or whatever it is, at different levels are of a different kind and a different order from those that you can do with maybe a foreign language. I'm not saying that this is against the other, but we need to give people confidence in Arabic and also in making mistakes in Arabic. And my autoethnography in my book is about making errors. I used to make errors. And I tried to see how you would combat the teachers, the guardians of Arabic, as I call them. I call people actually the guardians of Arabic fighting me back. I used to say, in Islam, if you make a ijtihad and you get it right, you get hasantain, ajran, and ajran. And if you get it wrong, you get one. Yeah, so I was getting one, and one is better than, if you speak in English, I used to say to them, you get nothing. Right.
Final question, Dr. Wilson.
I'd just like to ask your opinion, Liz, I think, about teaching scientists in the native language. And I think perhaps one of the things you might ask in Arabic is which native language are you teaching about? And then I'll confess a bit of pedagogical anxiety, because I've often repeated, and now I can't remember where I read this, that Arabization policy in Syria, which is called the Mabit al-Aruba, was successful, whereas it wasn't as successful for the Maghreb, except that it was unsuccessful because Syrian doctors cannot participate in international conferences because they know their entire medical terminologies in Arabic. I've never attended a medical conference in Syria, but I have in Egypt. And in Egypt, what happens is the doctors deliver their papers either in English or in Egyptian Arabic. And when it comes to the terminology, they switch immediately into English. And they're not being taught their medicine with Fusha. They're being taught their medicine in Ammiya.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we need to get away from either Fusha or Ammiya. I'm just getting away from that now, right? But let me also tell you that the claims that we teach medicine, I don't know about the AUB, that we teach medicine, for example, in Egypt or in Jordan. I know about Jordan. Because I have 4-hour recordings of people teaching medicine, and I just looked at them. Actually, what we do, the matrix sentences, it is Nahu Arabi with Mu'jam Inglisi. So are we really teaching medicine in Arabic? And in fact, when you take Syrian doctors outside, once they have got over their medical knowledge is not as any worse than medical knowledge. No, they're very good doctors. So the question is this. Now the question is about the utility of Arabic in relation to other languages. And that's a question of utility. It's not about, yeah. Yeah. Are you going to release me now?
Thank you so much, Dr. Sulaiman.
Thank you.
Bravissimo.